Part 1. Moving into the quiet house. When I first saw the place, it felt like the kind of house you could actually breathe in. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a wide porch that looked out onto a long gravel driveway. The realtor kept mentioning how quiet the neighborhood was, how nobody ever comes down this road unless they belong here. That first week, I thought she was right. Evenings were still. The kind of still where you can hear the crickets change their rhythm, the low hum of the fridge in the next room. I unpacked slowly, telling myself I'd have time to settle in. The driveway was my favorite part. It curved just enough to hide the road from view, so when I stood on the porch, it felt like the house existed in its own little bubble. Sometimes I'd sit out there with a coffee just to listen to nothing. The nights were darker than I was used to. No street lights, just the faint glow from my living room spilling out through the screen door. I started locking the porch door out of habit, even though the realtor had told me nobody locks their doors here. On the 4th night, I woke around midnight. No reason, just one of those moments where you're suddenly awake. The house was silent. Then, faint but distinct, I heard it, the slow crunch of gravel from outside. I lay there, my breath caught, listening. It wasn't the wind or an animal. These were steps, heavy enough to shift the stones, spaced just far enough apart to be a person walking. They stopped. The silence after was heavier than the sound had been. I didn't move for the rest of the night. Part 2. Footsteps on the gravel at midnight. The next morning, I told myself it must have been a neighbor passing through. Maybe someone taking a shortcut, though I knew there was nowhere to go beyond my place except a wall of thick trees. I didn't think about it again until 2 nights later. I was sitting on the couch, a lamp casting a pale circle of light on the floor when it happened again. Crunch. Slow, deliberate. The sound came from the far end of the driveway, moving closer. I muted the TV and leaned forward, holding my breath. The steps were steady, too heavy for a raccoon or stray cat. They reached the bend in the gravel and kept coming. Halfway up the drive, they stopped. I waited for them to start again, but they didn't. No car door, no voice, no retreating steps, just stillness. I finally got up and went to the window. The porch light threw a weak glow onto the gravel, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no movement. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something to shift in the dark. That night, I locked every door in the house, even the ones inside. The next morning, when I went to get the paper, I noticed something strange. The gravel right in front of the porch steps was disturbed, like someone had stood there for a long time, shifting their weight back and forth. I looked down the length of the driveway. It was empty, as if nothing had ever been there at all. But that night, when I lay in bed, I found myself listening for it, waiting for those steps to come back. Part 3. The figure that never walks away. It was the 5th night when I saw it. The sound started the same way. A slow crunch on the gravel, each step spaced like whoever was walking knew I was listening. I sat in the dark this time, lights off, blinds tilted just enough for me to see the curve of the driveway. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped again, right where they always stopped. This time, though, I could make out a shape. Tall, still, facing the house. I couldn't see a face. Not with the porch light casting more shadow than clarity. The figure stood just outside the glow, like it knew exactly where to be unseen. I told myself to move, to grab my phone, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed fixed on that shape, my breath shallow. It didn't move. Not a single shift in posture, no sway like a person just standing around. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. I couldn't tell. Then, as if it had been listening for something and didn't hear it, the figure stepped backward into the dark. The crunch of the gravel was slow, deliberate, until it faded entirely. I stayed by the window until dawn. In the morning, I walked to the spot where it had stood. The gravel was pressed flat, an oval the size of a pair of boots, but there were no tracks leading to it, or away from it. That night, I left the porch light off. I didn't want to see if it came back. Part 1. Checking in after dark. I'd been driving for hours, chasing the last scraps of daylight along a 2-lane highway when the rain started. Not a light drizzle, thick sheets that blurred the road ahead until my headlights felt useless. I spotted the motel sign through the downpour, its neon letters flickering weakly. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Peeling paint, doors that opened directly to the parking lot, a faded vending machine under the awning. The clerk slid me a key without much conversation. Room 6, end of the row. Inside, the carpet was damp at the edges, and the smell of stale air clung to everything. I dropped my bag on the bed and listened to the rain hammer against the thin windows. It was almost comforting, like white noise. Almost. Around midnight, the rain eased into a softer patter, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, uneven, splashing through the shallow puddles in the lot. I thought it might be another guest heading to their room, but the steps didn't pass by. They stopped. I glanced at the curtain, a thin strip of light from the parking lot bleeding through. A shadow moved across it, tall, narrow, lingering. I didn't move. The steps started again, closer this time, until they were right outside my door. The sound changed, less splashing now, more of a wet shuffle on the concrete walkway. The shadow stayed in front of the window for a long moment, then slowly slid out of sight. I waited for a door to open, a car to start, something. Nothing happened. Only the rain kept going. Part 2. Footsteps in the flooded parking lot. The next night I told myself it had been nothing. A late-night smoker, maybe someone walking their dog in the rain. Still, I kept the chain lock fastened when I went to bed. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up without knowing why. The rain was heavier than before, drumming against the glass, and beneath it, there it was again. Footsteps. Not quick, not rushed, just a slow, steady crossing of the parking lot. Each step landed with a splash, the kind of sound you only get from someone wearing heavy boots in ankle-deep water. I slid quietly out of bed, careful not to let the frame creak, and stood near the window. Through the thin curtain, I could make out the hazy glow of the lot's single floodlight. The water pooled on the pavement, shimmered like oil. The steps came closer, breaking the reflections. Then they stopped, not in front of my room, but somewhere just off to the side. I leaned toward the window, just enough to see the corner of the walkway. A shape stood there, just outside the reach of the light. They weren't moving. For almost a full minute, the figure stayed still, head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then, slowly, they turned toward my door. I stepped back without thinking. My heel caught on the carpet, and for a second I swore the steps started again, not toward the parking lot, but toward me. But when I looked back through the curtain, the figure was gone. Only the water rippling in the lot showed where they'd been. Part 3, when they stopped right outside my door. By the third night, the rain hadn't let up. It fell in constant sheets, pooling under the buzzing floodlight in the middle of the lot. I'd planned to check out in the morning, but something kept me restless, pacing the small space between the bed and the door. It was close to 2 a.m. when I heard them again, the same slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the water. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stood by the door, my ear inches from the thin wood, listening. The splashes grew louder, closer. Then they stopped right outside my room. The sound shifted. No longer boots in water, but the faint creak of the concrete walkway under weight. I could feel the vibration through the floor, just a subtle change, but enough to know someone was standing there. I waited for a knock, for the handle to turn, for anything. But nothing came. Instead, I heard the sound of slow breathing. Not deep, not labored, just steady, like they were waiting for me to make a sound. I pressed my hand to the chain lock, not sure if I wanted to hold it in place or unlock it and fling the door open. Before I could decide, the breathing stopped. The silence was worse. Then came the sound of water again, footsteps moving away, slower than before, splashing back into the lot. I pulled the curtain just enough to see. The lot was empty, but a single wet footprint, darker than the concrete, marked the walkway in front of my door. It pointed toward the room, and there was no second footprint beside it. Part 1. Watching the sun go down alone. The cabin wasn't mine. A friend had offered it to me for the weekend. Off the grid, she'd said. No neighbors, no traffic, just quiet. After a month of city noise, it sounded perfect. The place sat at the edge of a wide clearing, the porch facing a wall of tall pines. There was a single dirt road leading in, and when you stood out front, you could hear the wind moving through the trees like it was carrying secrets. The first evening, I pulled an old rocking chair onto the porch and watched the sun slip behind the tree line. The air grew cooler, and the woods turned into a solid wall of shadow. I kept expecting to hear crickets or nightbirds, but the quiet stayed unbroken. As the last light drained from the sky, I felt that subtle shift, the one where you can't quite see into the trees anymore, and every dark space looks like it could be hiding something. I went inside, locked the door, and made tea. The cabin creaked softly as it cooled, the sound of settling wood mixing with the faint tick of the clock above the fireplace. Somewhere around midnight, I stepped back onto the porch. The air was colder now, sharp in my lungs. The clearing was lit only by the thin silver of the moon. That's when I thought I heard it. Faint, deliberate steps on the dry leaves at the edge of the woods. Too slow for an animal, too heavy. I stayed still, listening. The steps stopped. The silence after was deep enough to feel. I went back inside, but even after I shut the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing out there, just beyond the line where the porch light faded. Part 2. Circling footsteps in the yard. The second night started the same way. The rocking chair, the quiet, the shadows stretching out from the trees. But this time, I didn't stay out as long. The woods felt different, heavier. I locked up early and tried to read, the faint hiss of the fireplace filling the room. Hours later, I heard it again. Not from the woods this time, but closer. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching over the frost-hardened grass of the yard. Not approaching directly, circling. I moved to the window, careful to keep the light behind me. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, a shape passed between the pines. It wasn't walking toward the porch. It was tracing the perimeter of the yard, moving with an unhurried, steady rhythm. Each step sounded heavier than the last. I backed away from the window and stood in the center of the room, trying to listen past the thud of my own pulse. The footsteps shifted direction, the sound moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Then they stopped. I waited. When they started again, they were closer, in the grass just a few yards from the porch. My chest felt tight, every muscle locked in place. The sound made a slow half circle, then faded back toward the woods. I stayed by the window until the clearing was empty again. But even when the sound was gone, the impression stayed. Like whatever had been out there was still watching, just waiting for the right moment to come closer. Part 3. The quiet knock. After they vanished. The final night, the air felt wrong before the sun even went down. The woods were silent again, but this time the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was tight, as if the whole place was holding its breath. I sat in the rocking chair for less than 10 minutes before going inside and locking the door. Every window latch, every deadbolt, I checked twice. Midnight came, and with it, the footsteps. They started at the edge of the woods, the same slow rhythm I'd heard before. Crunch, pause, crunch. But instead of circling, they came straight across the clearing. I stood at the side window, keeping my head low. The moonlight caught movement, a figure moving with steady purpose, never breaking stride until it reached the porch steps. The sound of boots on wood made my stomach knot. 1 step, 2, 3, then silence. I stared at the door, the outline of it faint in the glow from the fireplace. My ears strained for any sign of retreat, but none came. When the knock came, it was soft, almost polite. 3 taps, I didn't move. Another knock. Same rhythm, same weight. The air felt colder. My breath fogged in front of me, though the fire was still burning. Then, just as slowly as they'd come, the footsteps moved away. Down the porch steps, across the clearing. I watched from the window until the figure reached the trees, and kept watching even after it disappeared into the dark. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch. There were no footprints in the frost.